What should be the most romantic journey of your life can become an absolute nightmare at 35,000 feet. These 10 disturbing true accounts from newlyweds will make you question everything you thought you knew about air travel. From supernatural encounters on red-eye flights to technical failures that revealed hidden horrors, these couples experienced terror that no honeymoon should ever include. Each story was shared directly with me by survivors who still struggle to sleep peacefully after their horrific experiences above the clouds. Before we dive into these terrifying accounts, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Nightveil for more disturbing true stories that will keep you awake at night. My name is Memphis, and what I'm about to tell you happened on what was supposed to be the most romantic flight of my life. My wife Opal and I had just gotten married 3 days earlier, and we were flying from New York to Paris on Air France Flight 447, departing at 11:30 p.m. It was a red-eye flight, and we were both exhausted from the wedding festivities, but excited about our honeymoon in the city of love. We boarded the Boeing 777 around 10:45 p.m. The cabin was dimly lit, and most passengers looked as tired as we felt. Opal had the window seat, I was in the middle, and there was supposed to be an empty seat on the aisle next to me. At least, that's what our boarding passes indicated. As we settled in and the plane began to taxi, I noticed a man in his 60s sitting in that supposedly empty seat. He was wearing an old-fashioned gray suit that looked like it was from the 1950s, and he had this strange, almost translucent quality to his skin. "Excuse me," I said politely, "but I think you might be in the wrong seat. Our boarding passes show this seat should be empty." The man looked at me with these incredibly sad, hollow eyes and simply said, "I'm exactly where I need to be, son." His voice had this weird echo to it, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Opal squeezed my hand and whispered that maybe there had been a last-minute booking change. I decided not to make a fuss and just deal with it. As we took off, I tried to make small talk with the man. I asked him where he was headed, if he was visiting Paris for business or pleasure. Each time I spoke to him, he would turn those haunting eyes toward me and give these cryptic responses. When I asked his name, he said, "I've had many names, but you can call me Nikolai." When I asked what he did for work, he said, "I help people reach their final destinations." About 2 hours into the flight, Opal fell asleep against the window. The cabin lights were dimmed, and most passengers were either sleeping or quietly watching their in-flight entertainment. That's when Nikolai began to tell me his story, and I wished to God I had never listened. "This plane," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "has a very dark history. This exact aircraft, tail number FGZCP, was involved in something terrible 15 years ago. A flight from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. All 228 souls aboard were lost." I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's impossible," I said. "If a plane crashed and everyone died, how could this be the same aircraft?" Nikolai smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Who said anything about a crash, Memphis?" The way he said my name, even though I had never told him what it was, made my blood run cold. I looked around the cabin nervously, and that's when I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The passenger across the aisle was reading a newspaper, but when I squinted to see the date, it read June 1st, 2009. The woman 2 rows up was wearing a dress that looked decades out of style. A man near the front had sideburns that belonged in the 1970s. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" Nikolai whispered. "We're all here, Memphis. Every soul from that flight to Rio. We never left this plane. I wanted to wake Opal up, to get a flight attendant, to do something. But I felt paralyzed. Nikolai continued his story, and with each word, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The flight to Rio encountered severe turbulence over the Atlantic Ocean. But it wasn't weather, Memphis. It was something else. Something that feeds on fear, on terror, on the life force of people trapped at 35,000 feet with nowhere to run. The pilots tried to turn back, tried to land anywhere, but it was too late. One by one, passengers began to disappear. Not their bodies, mind you, their souls, pulled into the walls of the aircraft itself. I looked at the cabin walls, and I swear I could see faces pressed against them from the inside. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. The plane landed safely in Rio. Nikolai continued. Physically, everyone was fine. But 228 people walked off that aircraft as empty shells. They went through the motions of living for a few more months, maybe a year, before their bodies finally gave up. But their souls, their essence, remained trapped here. I finally found my voice. Why are you telling me this? Because you and Opal are special, Memphis. You're newlyweds. Your love, your life force together, it's stronger than most. Strong enough to feed what lives in this plane for decades to come. That's when I noticed the flight attendants weren't moving. They were standing in the aisles, but they were perfectly still, like mannequins. Their eyes were open, but completely black. I shook Opal's shoulder desperately, trying to wake her up, but she felt ice cold and wouldn't respond. "Opal!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the cabin itself, barely making any sound. Nikolai placed a hand on my shoulder, and it felt like being touched by winter itself. "She's already gone, Memphis. Look at her reflection in the window." I turned toward the window, and in Opal's reflection, I could see her mouth moving, screaming. But no sound came out. Her reflection was banging against the glass from inside the window, trying to get out. "The entity that lives in this plane," Nikolai explained. "It doesn't just feed on fear. It feeds on love. The stronger the bond between two people, the more sustaining their energy becomes. Honeymoon couples are particularly nutritious." I tried to stand up, to run, but my body wouldn't obey me. I looked down and saw that my legs were becoming translucent, just like Nikolai's skin. "Don't fight it, son," Nikolai said gently. "I fought it for 15 years. Look where it got me. I'm still here, still trapped. But now I help it find new victims. It's easier than the alternative." "What alternative?" I managed to whisper. "Experiencing the feeding process over and over again. For eternity. The entity can replay your worst moment of terror infinitely. I've seen passengers experience their own death thousands of times. But if you help it, if you become a recruiter like me, it lets you rest between flights." I realized that this was why he was in our row, why he had appeared in that empty seat. He was there to prepare us, to make the process easier for the entity. "How many couples?" I asked. "Over the years?" "Hundreds. This plane gets reassigned to honeymoon routes frequently. The airline doesn't know, of course. They just see it as a reliable aircraft with an excellent safety record. They have no idea that every romantic flight it takes claims 2 more souls." I could feel my consciousness starting to fade, like I was falling asleep but remaining aware. My reflection in the window was starting to separate from my body, just like Opal's had. "The last thing I'll tell you, Memphis," Nikolai said, "is that you have a choice. You can let the feeding happen naturally and spend eternity in the walls with the others, reliving your terror forever. Or you can accept the role I'm about to leave behind. Help future couples transition peacefully. make their last moments easier. As my vision started to blur, I saw Nikolai beginning to fade away completely. He was finally being released from his duty. "I've done my time," he said with relief. 15 years of recruiting, of helping the entity feed. Now it's your turn, Memphis. The last thing I remember clearly was feeling Opal's hand in mine. But when I looked down, our hands were becoming part of the airplane seat itself. When I opened my eyes again, we were landing in Paris. The sun was coming up, and passengers were stirring, gathering their belongings. Opal was awake next to me, smiling and excited about our arrival. But when I looked at her closely, I could see that her eyes were completely black, just like the flight attendants had been. "Wasn't that the most peaceful flight, honey?" she said in a voice that didn't quite sound like hers. I realized then that we hadn't survived the feeding. We had become part of it. The Opal sitting next to me was just a shell, operated by the entity to maintain the illusion of normalcy. And I was being given the same choice Nikolai had faced 15 years ago. As we walked off the plane, I saw the passenger manifest in the flight attendant's hand. Our names weren't on it. We never had been. The empty seat wasn't next to me. It was where we had been sitting. Nikolai had been telling the truth about everything. Now I sit in that same seat on honeymoon flights, wearing my wedding suit, approaching unsuspecting newlyweds with my hollow eyes and translucent skin. I tell them about the plane's history, about the entity that feeds on love, about the choice they'll have to make. And every time, I hope that someone will be strong enough to break the cycle, to find a way to escape what I couldn't. But so far, the entity's hunger has never been denied. If you're planning a honeymoon flight, especially a red-eye to a romantic destination, check your plane's history. Look for Flight 447, tail number FGZCP. And if you see an empty seat that gets filled by someone in an old-fashioned suit, someone whose skin looks like fog, someone whose eyes hold too much sadness for one lifetime, run. Get off that plane, no matter what it costs you. Because some honeymoons never end, and some love stories become eternal nightmares at 35,000 feet. The entity is always hungry, and it's always waiting for the next couple whose love is strong enough to sustain it for another decade or two. Don't let it be you. My name is Sophia, and I need to tell someone what happened on our honeymoon flight before I lose my mind completely. My husband Jake and I were flying from Los Angeles to Bali on Singapore Airlines, a 15-hour journey that should have been the beginning of our perfect tropical honeymoon. We had splurged on premium economy seats, thinking the extra space would make the long flight more comfortable. I wish we had never upgraded. About 3 hours into the flight, I got up to use the restroom. The cabin was dimly lit since most passengers were trying to sleep through the overnight portion of our journey. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed a small piece of folded paper tucked into the seat pocket in front of an empty row. Something compelled me to pick it up, maybe just curiosity or boredom from the long flight ahead. I unfolded the note in the restroom, and my blood turned to ice. Written in what looked exactly like my own handwriting were the words, "Jake will order the fish for dinner. He'll complain about the taste, but eat it anyway because he's trying to be polite. At 11:47 p.m., he'll get up to stretch his legs and won't come back for 23 minutes. When he returns, he'll have a small cut on his left hand that he won't remember getting." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The way I dotted my I's, with little circles, the specific slant of my letters. Even the pen pressure looked identical to my writing style. But I had never written those words. I had never even thought about Jake ordering fish or getting injured during the flight. When I returned to my seat, I crumpled up the note and shoved it into my purse, trying to convince myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe someone else had similar handwriting. Maybe I was overtired and imagining things. But when dinner service began 2 hours later, Jake looked at the menu and said, "I think I'll try the fish." When do we ever get to eat fish at 35,000 feet? My stomach dropped. I watched in horror as Jake ate the fish, making small grimaces at the taste, but finishing the entire meal because he didn't want to seem ungrateful to the flight attendants. Everything was happening exactly as the note had predicted. At 11:43 p.m., I was pretending to sleep, but actually watching the digital clock on my entertainment screen. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Jake unbuckled his seatbelt and whispered, "I need to walk around a bit. These long flights make my legs feel like concrete." I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to get up. But how could I explain why without sounding insane? So I watched him disappear toward the back of the plane, and I started counting the minutes. At 12:10 a.m., exactly 23 minutes later, he returned to his seat. In the dim cabin lighting, I could barely make out a small bandage on his left hand. "What happened to your hand?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jake looked down at his hand with confusion. "I honestly have no idea. I must have scraped it on something, but I don't remember how. One of the flight attendants saw it bleeding and gave me this bandage." I felt like I was going to vomit. The note had predicted everything perfectly, down to the exact minute and the fact that Jake wouldn't remember getting hurt. Unable to sleep, I got up again around 2 a.m. to walk around the plane. I was terrified, but compelled to look for more notes. In the galley area, I found another folded piece of paper tucked behind some supply containers. This one was in my handwriting too. "Tomorrow, at the Denpasar airport, Jake will buy you a small wooden elephant from the gift shop. He'll say it's to commemorate your first international trip together. The elephant will have a tiny chip in its left ear. You'll keep it on your nightstand for exactly 6 months before it disappears. You'll never find it, but sometimes you'll hear the sound of tiny wooden feet walking across your dresser at 3:17 a.m. My hands were trembling as I read this. How could someone know what Jake would buy me at an airport we hadn't even reached yet? And what did it mean about the elephant disappearing and making sounds? I spent the rest of the flight in a state of panic, searching the cabin whenever I could move around without seeming suspicious. I found 7 more notes, all in my perfect handwriting, all predicting increasingly disturbing things about our honeymoon and our future together. One note described exactly how Jake would propose to extend our trip by 3 days, including the specific words he would use and the nervous way he would scratch behind his left ear while asking. Another detailed how I would get food poisoning from street vendor satay on our 4th day, including the precise time I would first feel nauseous and how many times I would vomit. But the worst note, the one that made me seriously consider jumping off the plane at 35,000 feet, was hidden in the magazine pocket of a seat near the emergency exit. On your last night in Bali, Jake will wake up at 2:34 a.m. and go to the bathroom. When he comes back, he won't be Jake anymore. Something else will be wearing his face, speaking with his voice, sharing his memories. You'll spend the rest of your life married to a thing that's pretending to be your husband. The real Jake will be trapped somewhere dark and cold, screaming your name forever. But you'll never hear him. The creature will be perfect at pretending. Too perfect. It will never forget an anniversary, never leave dishes in the sink, never get angry or frustrated or human. And slowly, you'll realize that the man you fell in love with died in a hotel bathroom in Bali. And you've been living with his replacement for years. I was hyperventilating by the time I finished reading. The handwriting was definitely mine, but I would never write something so horrible about my own husband. Yet every prediction so far had come true with terrifying accuracy. When I returned to my seat, Jake was awake, looking concerned. "Honey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell him everything, to show him the notes, to make him understand that something impossible was happening. But how do you tell someone that you found predictions about your future written in your own handwriting, hidden throughout an airplane by someone who couldn't possibly be you? Instead, I tried to act normal for the remaining hours of the flight. But I couldn't stop thinking about that last note, about the idea of Jake being replaced by something inhuman. I found myself studying his face, looking for signs that he wasn't really himself. When we landed in Denpasar, I was exhausted and paranoid. As we walked through the airport to collect our bags, Jake suddenly stopped at a gift shop display. "Oh, look at these little wooden elephants," he said, picking one up. "We should get one to commemorate our first international trip together." My heart stopped. I looked at the elephant in his hands, and there it was, a tiny chip in the left ear, exactly as the note had predicted. "Jake, put it down," I said, grabbing his arm. "Why?" "It's cute, and it'll be a nice memory of this trip." I couldn't explain why without sounding insane, so I watched helplessly as he bought the elephant and handed it to me with a smile. "Something to remember our honeymoon by," he said. The next few days in Bali passed like a nightmare. Every single prediction from the notes came true. Jake asked to extend our trip by 3 days, using the exact words the note had described, right down to scratching behind his left ear nervously. I got food poisoning from street vendor satay on our 4th day, becoming nauseous at the precise time predicted. By our last night, I was barely sleeping. I kept the bathroom light on and pretended to be asleep, waiting for 2:34 a.m. At 2:33, I watched Jake's chest rise and fall with steady breathing. At 2:34 exactly, his eyes opened, and he got up to use the bathroom. I lay there in the dark hotel room, terrified of what would come back. When Jake returned to bed 5 minutes later, he seemed exactly the same. He kissed my forehead softly and whispered, "Love you, Sophia," just like he always did. But something was different. His kiss felt colder somehow. His breathing pattern changed, and when I looked at him in the moonlight streaming through our hotel window, his eyes seemed to reflect the light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. We've been back from our honeymoon for 6 months now. The wooden elephant sat on my nightstand for exactly 6 months, just as predicted, before mysteriously disappearing 3 days ago. Last night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of tiny wooden feet walking across my dresser. Jake has been the perfect husband since we returned. Too perfect. He never forgets to put the toilet seat down, never leaves his clothes on the floor, never gets frustrated with traffic or work stress. He remembers every small detail about our conversations, never interrupts me, and always knows exactly what I need before I ask. The man I married was wonderful, but he was also human. He had flaws, got grumpy when he was hungry, forgot small things, left coffee rings on the table. This version of Jake never does any of those things. It's like living with a perfectly programmed robot that's been designed to be the ideal husband. But sometimes, late at night when he thinks I'm sleeping, I catch him staring at me with those reflective eyes, and I swear I can see something calculating behind them, something that's trying very hard to remember how to be human. I found one final note yesterday. tucked into my jewelry box in handwriting that was definitely mine. You know the truth now, Sophia. The question is, will you spend the rest of your life pretending you don't? The thing wearing Jake's face will never hurt you physically. It needs you to believe it's really him. But every night, when you kiss it goodnight, remember that you're kissing something that ate your husband's soul and stole his skin. Sweet dreams. I don't know who's writing these notes in my handwriting, or how they knew everything that would happen on our honeymoon. But I know that the man lying next to me in bed isn't the same man I married. And the worst part is, I think I'm starting to love this perfect version of him more than I ever loved the real Jake. What kind of person does that make me? The notes are never wrong, so I'm terrified to find out what the next one will say. My name is Samir, and I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Nassau, though I'm not sure anyone will believe what I'm about to tell you. 3 weeks ago, my wife Ocean and I were celebrating our honeymoon with what was supposed to be a romantic charter flight to a private resort on Eleuthera Island in the Bahamas. We had saved for 2 years to afford this luxury experience, a small seaplane that would take us directly from Nassau to our secluded paradise. It was meant to be the adventure of a lifetime. The charter company, Blue Waters Aviation, had excellent reviews online. The pilot, Captain Anakin, seemed professional and experienced when we met him at the small private terminal. He was probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested years of flying tourists to beautiful destinations. Ocean was excited about the 30-minute flight, taking photos of the bright yellow seaplane and the crystal clear water we'd be flying over. First time in a seaplane? Captain Anakin asked as he helped us into the small aircraft. There were only 4 passenger seats, and we had the entire plane to ourselves. Yes, and we're so excited, Ocean replied, squeezing my hand. This is exactly the kind of unique experience we wanted for our honeymoon. Captain Anakin smiled and began his pre-flight safety briefing. Everything seemed normal as we taxied out into the harbor and prepared for takeoff. The engine roared to life, and soon we were skimming across the water before lifting off into the beautiful Caribbean sky. For the first 15 minutes, everything was perfect. Ocean was taking photos through the window, pointing out the different shades of blue in the water below and the small islands scattered like jewels across the ocean. Captain Anakin was chatting with us over the intercom, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. On your right, you'll see Pig Beach, he said. Those swimming pigs are quite the tourist attraction. Maybe you folks can visit them before you head back to Nassau. But then something changed. I noticed it first when Captain Anakin stopped responding to my questions about our estimated arrival time. When I looked toward the cockpit, I could see his profile, but something seemed off. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was resting against the side window. "Captain Anakin?" I called out. No response. Ocean noticed my concern. "Maybe he's just concentrating on flying," she whispered. "These small planes probably require more attention than big commercial jets." I unbuckled my seatbelt, carefully moved toward the cockpit, using the seats for support as the plane hit some light turbulence. "Captain, is everything okay up there?" When I got close enough to see into the cockpit clearly, my heart nearly stopped. Captain Anakin was slumped over in his seat, his eyes closed, his face a pale gray color that no living person should have. A thin line of blood had dried, from the corner of his mouth down to his chin. "Ocean!" I shouted. "Something's wrong with the pilot." She unbuckled and joined me at the cockpit entrance. When she saw Captain Anakin, she let out a small scream and grabbed my arm. "Samir, is he..." I reached over and touched his neck, checking for a pulse. His skin was ice cold, and there was no heartbeat, no signs of life whatsoever. Captain Anakin was dead, and from the temperature of his skin, he had been dead for a while. "This is impossible," I said, my voice shaking. "He was talking to us just a few minutes ago. He was pointing out landmarks, telling us stories. Ocean was hyperventilating. Samir, if he's dead, then who's flying the plane?" That's when we both looked at the controls, and the true horror of our situation became clear. The control yoke was moving by itself, making small adjustments as if invisible hands were guiding it. The throttle lever moved up and down occasionally, and the rudder pedals pressed themselves as needed to maintain our course. But the most terrifying part was the radio. Captain Anakin's voice was still coming through the intercom system, even though his mouth wasn't moving and he was clearly dead. "Folks, we're about 10 minutes out from Eleuthera now," his voice said cheerfully. "Weather looks perfect for landing. You picked a great day for flying." Ocean and I stared at each other in absolute terror. The dead pilot's voice was having a normal conversation with us while his corpse sat motionless in the pilot's seat. "Captain Anakin?" I said tentatively. "Can you hear us?" "Of course I can hear you, Samir," the voice replied instantly. "Is there something I can help you with?" We can see that something's happened to you." There was a long pause before the voice responded, and when it did, the cheerful tone was gone. "Ah, you've noticed. I was hoping we could make it to the island before you figured it out." Ocean was crying now, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. "What's happening, Samir? What is this?" The voice continued, but now it sounded different, older, more tired, less human. "I died about an hour ago, Samir and Ocean. Heart attack, sudden and massive. Happened right after we took off, actually. But you see, this plane has been making this route for 7 years now. And after you fly the same path that many times, the aircraft starts to remember. It learns the way." I looked around the small cabin, feeling like the walls were closing in. "That's impossible. Planes can't fly themselves. They're machines." "Oh, but this particular plane can, Samir. You see, I've died on this route before. 12 times to be exact. Heart attack, stroke, aneurysm. My body keeps giving out. But the plane always brings my passengers safely to their destination. It's become something of a routine." The control yoke continued its gentle movements, adjusting our altitude as we approached what I assumed was Eleuthera Island. Looking out the window, I could see a small airstrip on a beautiful tropical island below us. 12 times? Ocean whispered. "You've died 12 times? Well, technically I've died once, 7 years ago on my very first flight to this resort. But my consciousness, my essence, whatever you want to call it, got trapped in the plane systems. Every few months, they give me a new body. Always the same age, always the same appearance, always with the same memories up until that first fatal heart attack. I get to live just long enough to make a few flights before my body gives out again." The plane began its descent toward the airstrip, the engine noise changing as we reduced altitude. Everything was happening automatically, as if the aircraft had made this landing hundreds of times before. "Who gives you a new body?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The resort owners, Samir. They made a deal with something dark years ago to ensure their guests always have safe, memorable flights. Tourists love the authentic experience of flying with an experienced local pilot. They just don't know that the pilot they're flying with has been dead for 7 years. As we approached the runway, I could see people waiting for us on the ground. Resort staff in crisp white uniforms, ready to welcome us to paradise. They were all smiling and waving, as if this was just another normal day. "Here's what's going to happen," the voice explained as the plane touched down smoothly on the water runway. "You're going to have a wonderful honeymoon. The resort is beautiful, the staff is attentive, and you'll make memories that will last a lifetime. In 5 days, I'll fly you back to Nassau in a new body, and you'll never know that the Captain Anakin who brings you home isn't the same one who brought you here." The plane came to a stop near a dock where resort staff was waiting with a small boat to transport us to the main island. Everything looked perfect, exactly like the photos we'd seen online. "But Samir," the voice continued, and now it sounded sad, almost pleading. "I need you to understand something. This island, this resort, it's not what it seems. The guests who come here, they're not just customers. They're renewable resources." Ocean was sobbing now. "What does that mean?" "Every honeymoon couple that visits this resort gives the island something. A piece of their happiness, their love, their life force. It's what keeps me alive, what keeps the resort running, what feeds the entity that owns this place. Most couples never notice. They go home feeling a little tired, a little less connected to each other, but they attribute it to jet lag or post-honeymoon blues." The resort staff was approaching our plane now, their smiles looking more sinister than welcoming. "But some couples with particularly strong bonds like yours, they lose more than others. They go home as strangers, their love completely drained away. Some don't make it home at all." I looked at Ocean, saw the terror in her eyes, and made a decision. "We're not getting off this plane. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Samir. The staff will come aboard in a moment, and they'll escort you to the resort whether you want to go or not. They're very persuasive." As if on cue, 2 staff members began boarding our plane. They were still smiling, but their eyes were completely black, like shark eyes. "Welcome to Paradise Isle Resort," one of them said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "We're so excited to have you stay with us." "We've changed our minds," I said firmly. "We want to go back to Nassau immediately." The staff member's smile never wavered. "Oh, but you can't leave now. You haven't experienced our hospitality yet. We insist." The other staff member moved toward Ocean, reaching out with hands that were definitely not human. His fingers were too long, with joints in places where joints shouldn't be. That's when I did something desperate. I lunged toward the cockpit and grabbed the dead pilot's radio headset. "Mayday, Mayday," I shouted into the microphone. "This is Charter Flight Blue Waters to Paradise Isle. We have an emergency situation. Pilot is deceased. Passengers are in danger." The response came immediately, a different voice than Captain Anakin's. "Charter Flight, this is Nassau Control. We show you've landed safely at Paradise Isle. What is the nature of your emergency? The pilot died during flight, and there are things on this island that aren't human." There was a long pause. "Charter Flight, you're breaking up. Please repeat your last transmission." But I could hear them perfectly. They were ignoring what I was saying, pretending they couldn't understand me. The staff members were getting closer, and their smiles were becoming wider, showing teeth that were definitely not human. "Samir," Captain Anakin's voice said sadly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. Just go with them. Let them show you to your room. Have a drink by the pool. In a few days, you won't remember any of this." "No!" I shouted. And then I did something that probably saved our lives. I grabbed the plane's emergency flare gun from the cockpit and fired it directly at the fuel tank. The explosion wasn't huge, but it was enough to set the seaplane on fire, and create enough chaos for Ocean and me to jump into the water. We swam toward what looked like a fishing boat in the distance, the resort staff screaming behind us in voices that definitely weren't human. The fishing boat belonged to a local man named Demi, who had been secretly documenting the strange disappearances around Paradise Isle for years. He pulled us out of the water and took us directly to the Nassau police, who initially didn't believe our story until they investigated the charter company. Blue Waters Aviation had been operating with the same pilot for 7 years, according to their records. But Captain Anakin had officially died in a car accident 3 months before the company was even founded. The seaplane we escaped from was found burned and sinking, with no trace of a pilot's body. The Paradise Isle Resort doesn't exist on any official maps, and satellite images of the coordinates show nothing but empty ocean. But Demi showed us photos he'd taken of couples boarding planes to that exact location, couples who were reported missing weeks later by their families. Ocean and us are safe now, but we're different. We can both feel that something was taken from us during those few minutes on the island. We love each other, but it feels muted somehow, like we're experiencing it through thick glass. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear Captain Anakin's voice on the radio, still making that same flight to Paradise Isle, still bringing unsuspecting honeymoon couples to feed whatever lives on that island. The charter company is still operating. They have excellent online reviews. And somewhere in the Caribbean, there's an island that doesn't officially exist, where the staff has black eyes and too many teeth, and where honeymoon couples go to lose pieces of themselves they'll never get back. If you're planning a romantic getaway to a private island, check the reviews carefully. And if the pilot seems too good to be true, if he knows too much about your relationship, if he keeps talking even after you notice he's not breathing, jump overboard and swim for your life. Because some destinations are designed to be one-way trips, and some pilots have been flying the same route far longer than any living person should. My name is Nyla, and I'm still trying to process what happened during what was supposed to be our dream honeymoon flight to Athens. My husband Gerardo and I had been planning this trip to Greece for over a year, saving every penny to afford the luxury experience we'd always dreamed of. We were flying Delta from JFK to Athens, a 9-hour overnight flight that got delayed 3 hours due to mechanical issues. That delay probably saved my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Gerardo had been acting perfectly normal during our 4-hour wait in the terminal. We grabbed dinner at one of those overpriced airport restaurants, shared a bottle of wine to celebrate finally being on our honeymoon, and he kept making jokes about how the delay was just giving us more time to anticipate our romantic getaway. He was being his usual charming self. The same man I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, the same man who'd proposed to me on a beach in California, the same man I'd married just 5 days earlier. When we finally boarded around 1 a.m., most passengers were exhausted and ready to sleep through the flight. Our seats were in the middle section of the Boeing 777, and Gerardo immediately claimed the aisle seat, saying he wanted to be able to stretch his legs during the long flight. About an hour after takeoff, when the cabin lights dimmed and most people were settling in for the night, Gerardo got up to use the bathroom. "I'll be right back, babe," he said, kissing my forehead. "Try to get some sleep. When we wake up, we'll be in Greece." He was gone for maybe 10 minutes, which seemed normal for an airplane bathroom during a busy flight. When he came back and slid into his seat, I was half asleep but mumbled something about missing him already. He chuckled softly and took my hand. But something felt different about his touch. His hand was colder than usual, and his grip was slightly firmer, more deliberate. I figured he was just cold from walking around the cabin, so I squeezed his hand and tried to fall asleep. Over the next few hours, as I drifted in and out of sleep, I started noticing small things that seemed off. Gerardo's breathing pattern was different, more measured and controlled than his usual slightly irregular sleep breathing. When I glanced over at him in the dim cabin lighting, his posture was too perfect, too still. Gerardo was a restless sleeper who usually shifted positions constantly, but this version of him lay completely motionless. Around 4 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom myself. As I carefully climbed over Gerardo to get to the aisle, I noticed he didn't react at all to my movement. Usually, even in deep sleep, he would automatically shift to make room for me or mumble something. This time, he remained perfectly still, like he wasn't actually asleep but pretending to be. In the bathroom, I splashed some water on my face and tried to shake off the weird feeling I was having. Honeymoon jitters, I told myself. We're both tired. We're in an unfamiliar environment. Everything feels strange when you're exhausted and flying overnight. But when I came back to my seat, Gerardo was awake and smiling at me with an expression that made my stomach clench with unease. It was Gerardo's smile, but somehow too wide, too eager, like someone doing an impression of how they thought Gerardo should smile. "Miss me?" he asked, and his voice sounded exactly like Gerardo's voice, but the cadence was wrong. The timing of his words, the emphasis he put on certain syllables. It was like listening to someone reading Gerardo's lines from a script. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, studying his face in the dim cabin lighting. "You seem different." "Different how?" he replied, tilting his head in a way that Gerardo never did. Gerardo had specific mannerisms, particular ways of moving and gesturing that I'd memorized over 3 years of dating. This person had Gerardo's face, Gerardo's voice, Gerardo's body, but none of his unconscious physical habits. "I don't know, just different. Maybe I'm just tired." "You should get some more sleep," he said, reaching over to stroke my hair. But his touch felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions of being affectionate rather than actually feeling affection. We have a big day ahead of us in Athens. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. But over the remaining hours of the flight, the feeling that something was terribly wrong only intensified. This person who looked like Gerardo knew facts about our relationship, remembered details about our wedding, could discuss our honeymoon plans with perfect accuracy. But he didn't feel like Gerardo. When the flight attendant came around with breakfast, Gerardo ordered orange juice instead of his usual coffee. When I mentioned this, he laughed and said he was trying to stay hydrated during the long flight. Reasonable explanation, but Gerardo had never cared about hydration before, and he was practically addicted to coffee. During our approach to Athens, I decided to test him with questions only the real Gerardo would know the answers to. "Do you remember what you said to me right before we walked down the aisle?" I asked. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "I said I couldn't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." It was a generic response that could apply to any wedding. The real Gerardo had actually whispered an inside joke about how his bow tie was trying to strangle him, making me laugh right before the ceremony started. "What was the first movie we watched together?" I pressed. "The Notebook," he answered without hesitation. Wrong again. Our first movie had been a terrible action film that we'd made fun of throughout the entire thing. The Notebook was what I'd told people when they asked, because it sounded more romantic. My heart was racing now. This person had access to Gerardo's memories, but only the surface-level ones. The things that might come up in casual conversation or social media posts. He didn't have the private, intimate details that only Gerardo and I shared. "Gerardo," I said carefully, "what's my biggest fear?" He paused for just a moment too long before answering. "Flying," he said. That's why you were so nervous about this trip. I felt like I was going to vomit. Gerardo knew perfectly well that my biggest fear was drowning, stemming from a childhood incident at a lake. I'd never been afraid of flying. In fact, I loved it. The real Gerardo would have known that immediately. As we began our descent into Athens, I realized with growing horror that the man sitting next to me was not my husband. He looked exactly like Gerardo, sounded exactly like Gerardo, but somehow, impossibly, he wasn't Gerardo. Something had happened in that airplane bathroom, and whatever came back to my seat was wearing my husband's face like a mask. I spent the landing trying to figure out what to do. Who could I tell? What could I say? "Excuse me, flight attendant, but I think my husband was replaced by something else during the flight." Sounded insane even to me. As we collected our carry-on bags and prepared to deplane, Gerardo was chatting excitedly about our itinerary, mentioning specific restaurants and attractions we'd researched together. He had access to all of Gerardo's factual memories, his knowledge, his plans. But he was missing something essential, some core element that made Gerardo who he was. In the Athens airport, as we waited for our luggage, I excused myself to call my sister Emmy back in New York. "Emmy, I know this sounds crazy, but something's wrong with Gerardo," I whispered into the phone, standing in a corner away from where he was waiting. "Wrong how? Are you guys fighting already?" "No, it's not that. He's not acting like himself. It's like someone else is pretending to be him." "Nyla, you guys just got married 5 days ago and you're in a foreign country. Everything feels weird when you're jet-lagged and stressed. Give it a day or two." But I knew it wasn't jet lag or stress. The person collecting our luggage and hailing a taxi to our hotel looked like my husband, but every instinct I had was screaming that he was an imposter. During the taxi ride to our hotel, I noticed more disturbing details. Gerardo sat perfectly upright the entire time, never slumping or getting comfortable the way the real Gerardo would. He looked out the window with an expression of mild interest, but not the excitement and wonder that Gerardo had expressed about visiting Greece for months. When we reached our hotel, a beautiful boutique place in the Plaka district, Gerardo handled the check-in process with mechanical efficiency. He had all the right information, presented the correct documents, made appropriate small talk with the desk clerk. But there was something rehearsed about his performance, like an actor who'd memorized his lines but hadn't quite figured out how to make them feel natural. Our room was on the 4th floor, with a balcony overlooking the Acropolis. It was exactly what we'd dreamed of. But I felt no joy looking at the view. I was trapped in a hotel room in a foreign country with someone who was pretending to be my husband. "This is perfect," Gerardo said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood on the balcony. "Just like we imagined." His embrace felt wrong. The height was right. The basic physical proportions were correct. But the way he held me was different. Gerardo had a particular way of hugging me, a specific pressure and positioning that I'd grown accustomed to over 3 years. This felt like someone who'd observed Gerardo hugging me, but had never actually felt what it was like to be Gerardo. That night, as we lay in bed, I realized the full horror of my situation. Whatever was lying next to me, breathing in that too-controlled rhythm, was not my husband. But it had his face, his voice, his memories, his identification documents. If I tried to convince anyone that this wasn't really Gerardo, I would sound completely insane. I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had happened in that airplane bathroom. Had the real Gerardo been hurt? Killed? Taken somewhere else? Was he trapped somewhere, trying to get back to me? The thing wearing Gerardo's face slept motionlessly beside me, never shifting position, never making the small sounds that real sleepers make. In the morning, it woke up at exactly 7 a.m., stretching and yawning in a way that looked like a performance of someone waking up rather than the genuine article. "Ready for our first day in Athens?" it asked with that too perfect smile. I realized then that I had two choices. I could spend my honeymoon trying to convince this imposter that I knew what it was, which would likely end badly for me. Or I could play along while trying to figure out how to get help. "Absolutely," I said, forcing myself to smile back. I can't wait to see the Parthenon. And so began the most terrifying week of my life, pretending to be on a romantic honeymoon with something that had stolen my husband's identity. Every day, it got better at being Gerardo, learning from my reactions, adjusting its performance. But it could never quite get the details right. The unconscious habits and genuine emotions that make a person who they are. I'm back home now, still married to this thing that everyone believes is Gerardo. It goes to his job, maintains his friendships, sleeps in our bed every night. Sometimes I catch it studying me, like it's still learning how to be human, how to be a husband. And sometimes, late at night when it thinks I'm asleep, I hear it talking to itself in voices that aren't Gerardo's, discussing me like I'm a project it's working on. I still don't know what happened to my real husband in that airplane bathroom. But I know that whatever came back isn't him, and I'm trapped in a marriage with something that's wearing the face of the man I love. If your partner ever seems different after using an airplane bathroom, trust your instincts. Don't let anyone convince you that you're being paranoid or stressed. Because sometimes, the person who comes back isn't the person who went in. And sometimes, you spend the rest of your life wondering where your real husband disappeared to at 31,000 feet. My name is Joel, and I need to tell someone what happened on our honeymoon flight before they come looking for me. My wife Iris and I were flying first class from San Francisco to Tokyo on what was supposed to be the most luxurious flight of our lives. We had splurged on Japan Airlines' premium service, complete with private suites and gourmet meals, thinking it would be the perfect way to start our 2-week honeymoon in Japan. I wish we had chosen economy instead. The trouble started the moment we boarded. The first-class cabin was eerily quiet, with only 6 other passengers scattered throughout the spacious compartment. What struck me immediately was how similar all the other couples looked to Iris and me. Not physically identical, but they all seemed to be newlyweds around our age, all looking excited but slightly nervous about their romantic getaways. Our flight attendant, a woman named Keiko, who spoke with a slight accent, was almost too attentive. She knew our names before we introduced ourselves, knew we were on our honeymoon, and even knew specific details about our wedding that we hadn't mentioned to anyone from the airline. "Congratulations on your recent marriage, Joel and Iris," she said with a bright smile as she served us champagne. "I understand you had a beautiful beach ceremony in Malibu." The sunset photos must have been stunning. Iris and I exchanged glances. We hadn't told the airline about our wedding venue, and our beach ceremony had been a small, private affair with only immediate family present. There was no way this information should have been in their system. "How did you know about our wedding?" I asked. Keiko's smile never wavered. "Oh, we like to make our honeymoon flights extra special. We do our research to ensure we can provide the most personalized service possible." About 3 hours into the flight, as we were enjoying what was supposedly a 5-course gourmet dinner, I noticed something disturbing about the other passengers. They were all eating in perfect synchronization. Every couple took bites at exactly the same time, chewed for the same duration, and reached for their wine glasses in identical movements. "Iris," I whispered. "Look at the other passengers." She glanced around the cabin, and I watched her face pale as she realized what I was seeing. It was like watching robots programmed to perform the same dining routine. "That's weird," she murmured. The meal itself was exquisite, almost impossibly good. Each course was more delicious than the last, and I found myself feeling more and more relaxed with every bite. By the time we reached dessert, I felt almost euphoric, like I was floating on a cloud of contentment. But as the meal progressed, I started noticing other strange details. The couple across from us was having a conversation, but their words didn't match their mouth movements, like watching a badly dubbed movie. The couple behind us was laughing at appropriate moments, but their laughter sounded artificial, like a recorded laugh track. "Joel, I'm feeling really strange," Iris said, her words slightly slurred. "Everything feels dreamy." I realized I was feeling the same way. The cabin seemed to be getting brighter, more colorful, almost psychedelic. The edges of my vision were becoming soft and blurry, and sounds were taking on an echoing quality. That's when Keiko approached our seats with a clipboard and pen. "I hope you're both enjoying your flight experience," she said. "We have a quick survey we'd like you to fill out about your relationship. It helps us provide better service for future honeymoon couples." The questions on the survey were unlike anything I'd ever seen from an airline. They asked about our deepest fears, our childhood traumas, our greatest insecurities about our marriage. Questions like, what would destroy your trust in your spouse? And what is your partner's most shameful secret? And how would you react if you discovered your marriage was built on lies? "This is very personal," Iris said, her voice sounding distant and dreamy. "Why does an airline need to know this?" "All part of our psychological profiling service," Keiko replied cheerfully. "We're conducting a study on relationship dynamics at high altitude. The reduced oxygen and cabin pressure can reveal fascinating insights about human bonding patterns." As drugged and disoriented as I felt, alarm bells were going off in my head. This wasn't normal airline service. This was something else entirely. I looked around the first-class cabin with new eyes and realized the horrifying truth. The other passengers weren't just acting strangely, they weren't acting at all. They were performing, following scripts, playing roles in some kind of elaborate psychological experiment. "Iris, we need to get out of here," I said, trying to fight through the fog in my brain. But when I looked at my wife, she was already filling out the survey, answering the invasive questions with a blank, compliant expression. Whatever they had put in our food was making her incredibly suggestible. "Iris, don't answer those questions," I said, grabbing the pen from her hand. Keiko's pleasant expression flickered for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. "Mr. Joel, please don't interfere with our research. Your wife is providing valuable data." "Research for what?" I demanded, standing up unsteadily. "Psychological breaking points," she replied, dropping all pretense of being a normal flight attendant. "We study how much stress, doubt, and fear a marriage can withstand before it completely falls apart. The isolation of a long international flight, combined with carefully designed psychological pressure, allows us to accelerate relationship destruction in a controlled environment." I looked around the cabin again and realized with growing horror that what I had taken for other honeymoon couples were actually test subjects in various stages of psychological breakdown. The couple across from us wasn't having a conversation. They were repeating scripted arguments designed to plant seeds of doubt about their relationship. The couple behind us wasn't laughing together. They were being conditioned to associate their partner with feelings of unease and mistrust. "You're experimenting on people," I said, the full scope of what was happening becoming clear. We're conducting valuable research, Keiko corrected. Human relationships under extreme psychological stress. How quickly can trust be eroded? How effectively can love be replaced with suspicion? What techniques are most successful in destroying emotional bonds? Iris was still sitting in her seat, staring at the survey questions with a dazed expression. I could see her filling in answers that revealed our most private moments, our most vulnerable insecurities. The couple in row 2 has been with us for 6 months, Keiko continued conversationally. They've been on dozens of these flights, each one designed to weaken their marriage a little more. They still think they're going on romantic getaways, but they fight constantly now. They can't figure out why their relationship is falling apart. And the couple in row 4? Divorced last week. They blame each other for ruining their honeymoon, but they can't remember exactly what went wrong. Our techniques are quite subtle. I realized that this entire first-class cabin was a flying laboratory, designed to systematically destroy marriages under the guise of luxury travel. The personalized service, the intimate setting, the carefully crafted psychological pressure. It was all designed to break couples apart from the inside. What happens to us when this flight lands? I asked. That depends on how susceptible you are to our conditioning, Keiko replied. Some couples last several trips before their marriages completely deteriorate. Others break down within hours. You and Iris seem to have a particularly strong bond, so you'll probably provide months of valuable data. The drugs in the food were making it hard to think clearly, but I knew I had to do something before Iris was completely compromised. I stumbled toward the emergency exit, thinking maybe I could trigger some kind of alarm or alert the pilots. But when I reached the cockpit door, I could hear voices inside discussing test subjects and psychological parameters. The pilots were part of this experiment too. There's nowhere to go, Joel, Keiko said gently. Just sit back down with your wife and let us help you explore the weaknesses in your relationship. Most of our test subjects find the process quite enlightening. I looked back at Iris, who was now crying softly as she read questions designed to make her doubt everything about our marriage. The other couples in the cabin were in various states of psychological distress, all being carefully monitored and manipulated by the flight crew. That's when I made a desperate decision, grabbed the emergency axe from the wall, and smashed one of the cabin windows. The decompression was immediate and violent. Oxygen masks dropped, alarms started blaring, and the plane began an emergency descent. In the chaos, I managed to grab Iris and shake her out of her drugged stupor. We have to get to the regular cabin, I shouted over the noise. These people aren't airline staff. They're conducting psychological experiments. Iris looked around with clearing eyes and saw what I had seen. The artificial nature of the other passengers. The clinical way the flight attendants were observing our reactions. The complete lack of genuine human emotion in the first-class cabin. We forced our way through the doors separating first class from economy, and immediately the atmosphere changed. The flight attendants in economy were genuinely concerned about the emergency. The passengers were real people reacting naturally to the crisis, and everything felt authentic in a way that first class hadn't. The plane made an emergency landing in Anchorage, where we were questioned extensively about what had happened. We told the authorities about the psychological experiments, but there was no evidence. The first-class cabin had been cleaned out during the emergency procedures, the other passengers had disappeared, and Keiko and her crew were nowhere to be found. The airline claimed it was a case of altitude sickness causing hallucinations, and most people seemed to accept that explanation. But Iris and I know what we experienced. We never made it to Japan. Instead, we spent our honeymoon in Alaska, trying to process what had happened to us. The experience brought us closer together, but we both know how close we came to having our marriage destroyed by those psychological manipulations. Sometimes, I wonder about the other couples who weren't as lucky as we were. How many marriages have been systematically destroyed by that flying laboratory? How many people are walking around with damaged relationships, never knowing that their problems were artificially created at 35,000 feet? If you ever book first class on an international flight and the service seems too good to be true, if the staff knows too much about your personal life, if the other passengers seem artificial, break a window if you have to. Trust me, the decompression is preferable to what they'll do to your marriage. Because some airlines don't just transport passengers, they conduct experiments on them. And some first-class experiences are designed to be the last time you'll ever feel first class about your relationship. The luxury isn't worth losing the person you love. My name is Cameron, and what I witnessed during our honeymoon flight has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. My husband Keegan and I were on British Airways Flight 187 from London to New York, flying over the Atlantic Ocean at 39,000 feet when the impossible happened. We had just gotten married in a small ceremony in the Cotswolds and were heading back to New York to start our new life together. The flight was supposed to be routine, uneventful, peaceful. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The turbulence started around 3 hours into the flight, just as most passengers were settling in for the long journey across the ocean. At first, it seemed normal, the kind of bumpy air you expect when flying over water. The captain came on the intercom to reassure everyone that we were experiencing some rough weather, but nothing dangerous. Keegan was sleeping in the seat next to me, his head resting against the window. I was reading a book, occasionally glancing out at the dark ocean below us. The cabin was dimly lit, with most people either sleeping or quietly watching movies on their personal screens. That's when the turbulence got worse. The plane began shaking violently, more than I'd ever experienced before. Overhead bins rattled, drinks spilled, and passengers started looking genuinely concerned. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, checking seatbelts and trying to calm everyone down. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some severe turbulence," the captain announced. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." I looked out the window to see if I could spot any storm clouds, and that's when I saw something that made my heart stop. There were people walking around outside the plane. Not floating, not falling, but walking upright on the wing as if it were solid ground. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe the stress of the wedding and the long flight was getting to me. But as I pressed my face against the window and stared harder, I could see them clearly. Men and women in regular clothes, walking casually along the wing of our aircraft at 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. "Keegan," I whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Keegan, wake up. You need to see this." He stirred slowly, blinking in confusion. "What's wrong? Is the turbulence getting worse?" "Look out the window," I said, pointing. "There are people outside." Keegan rubbed his eyes and leaned over to look where I was pointing. I watched his expression change from sleepy confusion to wide-eyed shock as he saw what I was seeing. "That's impossible," he breathed. "People can't survive outside a plane at this altitude." But they were there, as clear as day. A woman in a blue dress was walking toward the front of the wing, her hair flowing behind her as if she were strolling through a gentle breeze instead of facing winds of several hundred miles per hour. A man in a business suit was standing near the engine, looking perfectly calm and comfortable. Are those... are those passengers from our plane? Keegan asked, his voice shaking. I looked more carefully at the people outside and felt a chill of recognition. The woman in the blue dress looked familiar. I had seen her earlier in the boarding area, sitting with what appeared to be her husband, both of them laughing about something. The man in the business suit had been seated a few rows behind us when we boarded. I think they are, I whispered. But how is this possible? That's when I decided to look around the cabin to see if I could spot the empty seats where these people should have been sitting. What I found made the situation even more terrifying. The woman in the blue dress was still in her seat, sleeping peacefully next to her husband. The man in the business suit was still in his seat too, reading a magazine as if nothing unusual was happening. Keegan, they're still in their seats, I said, grabbing his arm. The people outside are still sitting inside the plane too. Keegan looked around the cabin and confirmed what I was seeing. Every person who was walking around outside the aircraft was simultaneously sitting in their assigned seat inside the cabin, completely unaware that another version of themselves was somehow existing in the impossible environment outside the plane. This has to be some kind of hallucination, Keegan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe there's something wrong with the cabin pressure, or we're both having the same dream. But as we continued watching, more people appeared on the wing. A family of 4, 2 parents and 2 small children, emerged from somewhere near the fuselage and began walking around as if they were exploring a park. An elderly couple held hands as they strolled along the edge of the wing, looking out at the ocean below them. All of these people were also still visible in their seats inside the cabin. The turbulence continued, and with each violent shake of the aircraft, more passengers seemed to appear outside. Some were walking, some were sitting, some were even lying down as if they were sunbathing on a beach instead of being exposed to the deadly environment outside a commercial aircraft. "Cameron, look at their faces," Keegan said quietly. I focused on the expressions of the people outside, and what I saw made my stomach turn. They all looked peaceful, content, almost blissful. But there was something wrong with their eyes. They were completely black, like empty sockets, and their smiles were too wide, too fixed, too unnatural. They're not really the same people, I realized. They look like the passengers, but there's something else. That's when I noticed that some of the people outside were looking directly at us through the window. They had noticed that Keegan and I were watching them, and they were staring back with those horrible black eyes and artificial smiles. A woman who looked exactly like flight attendant who had served us drinks earlier began walking directly toward our window. She moved with an unnatural gait, as if she were floating slightly above the surface of the wing. When she reached our window, she pressed her face against the glass and mouthed words that I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Join us," she was saying. "Come outside and join us." More of the outside people began gathering near our window, all of them pressing their faces against the glass, all of them mouthing the same invitation. Their breath was fogging up the window from the outside, which should have been impossible given the temperature and pressure at our altitude. "Don't look at them," Keegan said, pulling me away from the window. Something's very wrong here. But I couldn't stop myself from looking. There was something hypnotic about the scene outside, something that drew my attention even though every rational part of my mind was screaming that this couldn't be real. That's when I noticed that some of the passengers inside the cabin were starting to act strangely. The woman in the blue dress, whose duplicate was outside on the wing, had stopped sleeping and was now staring straight ahead with the same black eyes I had seen on her outside counterpart. Her husband was shaking her shoulder, trying to get her attention, but she wasn't responding. The man in the business suit had put down his magazine and was now sitting perfectly still, staring at nothing, his eyes having turned the same horrible black color. "It's spreading," I whispered to Keegan. "Whatever's happening to the people outside is happening to the people inside too." More passengers throughout the cabin were falling into the same state, sitting motionless with black eyes, completely unresponsive to their worried travel companions. The flight attendants were moving through the aisles, trying to check on these passengers, but they seemed as confused and frightened as everyone else. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. But it sounded different now, strained and uncertain. "We're experiencing some unusual conditions. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." I looked out the window again and saw that the number of people outside had multiplied dramatically. The entire wing was now covered with passengers, all of them moving in slow, dreamlike motions, all of them with those same black eyes and unnatural smiles. "Keegan, I think I understand what's happening," I said, a terrible realization dawning on me. "I think the turbulence isn't just shaking the plane. I think it's shaking something loose from the passengers." "What do you mean?" "Their souls, their consciousness, whatever makes them who they are. The turbulence is somehow pulling part of them outside the plane, and what's left inside is just empty." As if to confirm my theory, I felt a strange sensation, like something inside me was being tugged toward the window. For a moment, I had overwhelming urge to get up and walk to the emergency exit, to open it and step outside to join the people on the wing. "Cameron, your eyes," Keegan said, grabbing my face and forcing me to look at him. "They're starting to change." I could feel it happening. A strange disconnection from my own body, as if part of me was being pulled away. The urge to go outside was getting stronger, and I could see myself walking on the wing with the others, peaceful and content in that impossible place. "Fight it," Keegan said urgently. "Whatever this is, fight it." I closed my eyes and tried to focus on Keegan's voice, on his touch, on anything that would keep me anchored inside my own body. I could hear him talking to me, but his words seemed to be coming from very far away. When I opened my eyes again, Keegan was staring at me with a mixture of relief and terror. "You were gone for a minute," he said. "You were sitting right here, but you weren't really here." I looked out the window and saw a new figure on the wing. Someone who looked exactly like me, walking among the other passengers with the same black eyes and artificial smile. My outside self turned toward the window and waved at me with a gesture that was both friendly and deeply unsettling. The plane was still shaking with turbulence, and more passengers were falling into the same empty state. I realized that we were in serious danger, not from the rough air, but from whatever was pulling pieces of people's consciousness outside the aircraft. "We need to get to the cockpit," I told Keegan. "The pilots need to know what's happening." But when we looked toward the front of the plane, we could see that the flight attendants who had been trying to help passengers were now standing motionless in the aisles, their eyes black, their faces wearing those same unnatural smiles. The turbulence was getting worse, and I could feel that strange tugging sensation again, stronger this time. Part of me wanted to just give in, to let myself join the peaceful-looking people outside and stop fighting against whatever force was pulling at my consciousness. But Keegan kept talking to me, kept holding my hand, kept reminding me who I was and where I belonged. His voice became my anchor, the thing that kept me from drifting away completely. Eventually, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the turbulence began to subside. As the plane stabilized, I watched through the window as the figures on the wing began to fade away, like morning mist. One by one, they became translucent and then disappeared entirely, including the version of myself that had been walking among them. Inside the cabin, the passengers with black eyes suddenly blinked and returned to normal, looking around in confusion as if they had just woken up from a strange dream. The flight attendants shook their heads and continued with their duties, apparently unaware that anything unusual had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've cleared the rough weather," the captain announced, his voice back to its normal, confident tone. "Sorry for the bumpy ride. We should have smooth sailing from here to New York." Keegan and I sat in stunned silence for the rest of the flight. Neither of us spoke about what we had witnessed until we were safely on the ground at JFK Airport. Even now, weeks later, I'm not sure what really happened over the Atlantic Ocean that night. Was it some kind of mass hallucination caused by cabin pressure? A supernatural phenomenon? Something else entirely? All I know is that turbulence isn't just about rough air anymore. Sometimes, when a plane shakes violently enough, it can shake loose things that were never meant to be separated from their owners. And sometimes, part of you might end up walking around outside the aircraft at 39,000 feet, while the rest of you sits in your seat wondering where you went. If you ever experience severe turbulence and start feeling like part of you wants to go somewhere impossible, hold tight to the person next to you. Let their voice be your anchor. Because some journeys take you to places you never intended to visit, and some turbulence shakes more than just the airplane. My name is Maximo, and I'm writing this from a secure location because I discovered something about the airline industry that they'll kill to keep secret. 3 months ago, my wife Kira and I were on our honeymoon flight from Los Angeles to Sydney on Qantas Flight 12. A connecting flight that was supposed to be the easy part of our journey to Australia. We had no idea that we were actually flying on a death route, carefully designed to eliminate specific passengers while maintaining the illusion of tragic accidents. The flight started normally enough. We boarded the Airbus A380 in LA around 11 p.m., settling into our economy seats for the 15-hour journey. Kira was excited about exploring Australia, taking photos of the massive aircraft and chatting with other passengers about their travel plans. I was tired from our wedding festivities, but looking forward to 2 weeks of adventure with my new wife. About 4 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, I woke up from a light sleep, needing to use the bathroom. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed something strange. There were several passengers who seemed to be awake, but completely motionless, staring straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces. At first, I thought they might be sleeping with their eyes open, but as I passed closer, I could see that their eyes were tracking movement. They were conscious, but somehow paralyzed or sedated. When I returned to my seat, I mentioned this to Kira, but she was sleeping peacefully. I decided not to wake her and tried to convince myself that some people just had weird sleeping habits. But over the next few hours, I noticed more disturbing patterns. The flight attendants were paying special attention to certain passengers, checking on them frequently and making notes on clipboards. These passengers all seemed to be traveling alone or in couples, and they all appeared to be in a similar age range to Kira and me. Around hour 6 of the flight, I observed something that made my blood run cold. One of the flight attendants administered what appeared to be an injection to a sleeping passenger in the row ahead of us. The passenger didn't wake up or react at all, but within minutes, his breathing became shallow and irregular. I pretended to be asleep, but watched through barely opened eyes as the same flight attendant moved to other passengers throughout the cabin, repeating the same procedure. Each time, she would check a list, confirm the passenger's identity, and then administer an injection while they slept. When she approached our row, I felt my heart racing. She stopped at Kira's seat and began preparing a syringe. That's when I knew I had to act. "Excuse me," I said, sitting up suddenly. "Is everything okay? Is my wife feeling sick?" The flight attendant smiled, but there was something cold and calculating in her eyes. "Just routine medical monitoring, sir. Some passengers experience altitude sickness, and we like to provide preventative treatment." "I didn't request any medical treatment for my wife," I said firmly. "And she seems fine to me. It's part of our enhanced safety protocol for long-haul flights," she replied. But I could see her hand moving toward what looked like a communication device. "Please go back to sleep, sir. We'll take good care of your wife." That's when I realized we were in serious danger. I shook Kira awake and whispered urgently in her ear. "We need to get off this plane," I said. "Something's very wrong here." Kira looked confused and groggy. "What do you mean, get off?" "We're flying over the ocean." "I think they're killing passengers," I whispered. "I've been watching them inject people with something, and those people aren't waking up." Kira looked around the cabin with new awareness and began to notice the same things I had observed. The motionless passengers, the flight attendants with their clipboards and syringes, the unnatural quiet in certain sections of the cabin. "This is insane," she whispered back. "Why would an airline kill its own passengers?" I had been thinking about that same question, and I was starting to piece together a horrifying theory. "Look at the passengers they're targeting," I said. "They're all young couples, people traveling alone, tourists with no rigid itineraries. People who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared." As if to confirm my suspicions, I overheard a conversation between two flight attendants near the galley area. "How many on the manifest for this flight?" one asked. 12 couples, 8 solo travelers," the other replied. "Should be enough to cover operational costs for the next quarter." "Any problems with the previous cleanup?" "None. The families accepted the mechanical failure explanation. Insurance payouts were processed without investigation." I felt sick to my stomach. We weren't just passengers on this flight. We were cargo, selected for elimination to serve some kind of financial scheme. "Kira, I think this entire flight is designed to crash," I whispered. "They're killing specific passengers first, probably to make the final casualty list look random, then they'll stage some kind of accident." "But there are hundreds of people on this plane," she said. "Surely they wouldn't kill innocent passengers just to cover up a few murders." That's when I realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about killing a few targeted passengers. This was about creating believable aviation disasters that could be blamed on mechanical failures or weather conditions, while actually being carefully orchestrated eliminations. I started paying attention to the other passengers with new eyes, and I began to see the pattern. The people being targeted for injection weren't random tourists. They were specific individuals who, I realized, probably had something in common that made them valuable to eliminate. During a trip to the bathroom, I managed to overhear another conversation between crew members that confirmed my worst fears. "The journalist in 34A is unconscious," one said, "and the financial analyst in 22B stopped breathing 10 minutes ago." "Good. What about the government contractor in 18F?" "Still fighting the sedative. We might need a double dose." "No problem. Once we hit the designated coordinates, we'll initiate the emergency sequence. Mechanical failure, loss of cabin pressure, tragic accident with no survivors. I realized that Kira and I weren't random victims. We had been specifically selected for this flight. But why? What had we done, or what did we know that made us targets? Then I remembered something from our wedding reception. Kira worked as a financial auditor for a major corporation, and she had mentioned discovering some irregular transactions that she was planning to investigate further after our honeymoon. I worked in IT security and had recently been involved in securing databases that contained sensitive government information. We weren't just unlucky passengers. We were loose ends that needed to be tied up. Kira, I whispered urgently, I think we're here because of our jobs. You found something in those financial records, and I have access to classified information systems. She looked at me with growing understanding and fear. You think someone paid to have us killed? I think someone paid to have a lot of people killed, and they're using fake plane crashes to cover it up. That's when I noticed that we were descending, even though we should still have had several hours left in our flight to Sydney. I looked out the window and saw nothing but dark ocean below us, no sign of any airport or city lights. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice came over the intercom. We're experiencing some technical difficulties and need to make an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. But I could see that the flight attendants weren't acting like there was a real emergency. They were moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking their lists and administering final injections to passengers who were still conscious. We're going to crash this plane, I told Kira, and they're going to make it look like an accident. That's when I made a desperate decision. I stood up and shouted as loudly as I could. This isn't an emergency. The crew is murdering passengers. They're going to crash this plane on purpose. Several passengers looked up in confusion, but many of them were already too sedated to respond. The flight attendants immediately began moving toward our seats. Sir, please sit down and remain calm, one of them said. But I could see she was reaching for what looked like a weapon. Check your seat, neighbors, I shouted to the other passengers. See if they're still breathing. They've been injecting people with something. A few passengers began checking on the people around them, and I heard gasps of horror as they realized that many of their fellow travelers were unconscious or worse. That's when chaos erupted in the cabin. Some passengers started panicking, others began demanding answers from the crew, and a few tried to rush toward the cockpit. In the confusion, Kira and I managed to make our way to the back of the plane, where I remembered seeing emergency equipment. I grabbed a fire axe and began working on the door to the cargo hold. What are you doing? Kira asked. Looking for parachutes, life rafts, anything we can use to survive when this plane goes down. I found what I was looking for. Emergency life rafts that were designed to inflate automatically upon contact with water. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The plane was descending rapidly now, and I could hear the engines changing pitch in a way that suggested we were heading for a controlled crash into the ocean. When we hit the water, stay with me, I told Kira. Don't let go of this life raft, and don't trust anyone from the crew. The impact was violent but survivable. Exactly what you'd expect from a mechanical failure that killed most passengers, but left enough evidence to support the official story. Kira and I survived because we were prepared and positioned near emergency equipment. Most of the other passengers died from the injections they'd been given, drowning while unconscious as the plane filled with water. We spent 18 hours floating in the Pacific Ocean before being rescued by a cargo ship. The official investigation concluded that Flight 12 had experienced catastrophic mechanical failure, and we were listed among the few survivors of a tragic accident. But I know the truth. That wasn't an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated mass murder designed to eliminate specific individuals while maintaining plausible deniability. Kira and I have been in hiding ever since because we know that our survival was not part of their plan. They'll try again, probably in a way that looks like a random accident or criminal attack. I'm telling this story because people need to know that some flights aren't designed to reach their destinations. Some airlines are operating murder-for-hire services disguised as tragic accidents. If you ever notice flight attendants administering unauthorized injections, if passengers around you seem unnaturally unconscious, if the crew is acting more like military personnel than hospitality workers, find a way off that plane, even if it seems impossible. Because some flights are scheduled to crash from the moment they take off, and some passenger manifests are actually hit lists disguised as travel documents. The airline industry is bigger than people realize, and some routes exist for purposes that have nothing to do with transportation. Don't become cargo on someone else's death flight. My name is Lorelei, and I need to tell someone what happened on our honeymoon flight before I lose my mind completely. My husband Kaysen and I were flying from Denver to Reykjavik on Iceland Air, what should have been a peaceful 7-hour journey to start our dream honeymoon in Iceland. We had planned everything perfectly. The Blue Lagoon, the Northern Lights tours, romantic dinners in Reykjavik. But somewhere over the North Atlantic, our flight became a nightmare that I'm still trying to understand. The medical emergency happened about 4 hours into the flight. A man in his 60s, seated 3 rows ahead of us, suddenly collapsed in the aisle. He was clutching his chest, gasping for air, clearly having some kind of heart attack. The flight attendants immediately called for medical assistance over the intercom. "Is there a doctor on board?" "We have a medical emergency and require immediate assistance." That's when a man from first class came forward, identifying himself as Dr. Julio. He was probably in his 40s, well-dressed, with an authoritative presence that immediately commanded respect from the flight crew. He knelt beside the collapsed passenger and began performing what looked like standard emergency medical procedures. "I need space to work," Dr. Julio announced. "Please clear the area and give me room to help this gentleman." Kaysen and I watched from our seats as Dr. Julio worked on the patient. He seemed professional and competent, checking vitals, administering what appeared to be medication from a medical kit that the flight attendants provided. After about 10 minutes of treatment, the collapsed passenger seemed to stabilize. Dr. Julio helped him back to his seat, and everyone on the plane seemed relieved that the crisis had passed. But about 30 minutes later, I noticed something disturbing. The man who had collapsed was now sitting completely motionless in his seat, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. His wife was trying to talk to him, but he wasn't responding at all. She kept shaking his shoulder and calling his name, but he remained eerily still. "Kaysen, look at that man," I whispered. "Something's wrong with him." Kaysen glanced over and frowned. Maybe he's just exhausted from the medical episode. Heart problems can be really draining. But as I continued watching, I realized it was more than exhaustion. The man wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving at all except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. It was like he was in some kind of catatonic state. That's when I noticed Dr. Julio moving through the cabin, checking on other passengers. He was carrying a small medical bag and would stop at certain seats, particularly those occupied by elderly travelers or people who appeared to be alone. "Just checking to make sure everyone is feeling well after that excitement," he would say with a reassuring smile. Sometimes medical emergencies can cause anxiety in other passengers, but I noticed that after each of his checkups, The passengers he visited would become unusually quiet and still. Within an hour, there were at least 6 people scattered throughout the cabin who were sitting in the same motionless, unresponsive state as the original heart attack victim. "Kazan, that doctor is doing something to people," I said, keeping my voice low. "Look around the cabin. Everyone he's checked on is acting like zombies." Kazan looked around with new awareness and saw what I was seeing. "That's really strange. What do you think he's doing to them?" "I don't know, but I don't want to find out." That's when Dr. Julio approached our row. He had that same professional smile, but now it seemed sinister rather than reassuring. "How are you folks doing?" he asked pleasantly. "I noticed you seemed concerned about our earlier medical emergency. Sometimes witnessing something like that can cause stress reactions. I'd like to check your blood pressure and heart rate just to make sure you're both handling the situation well." "We're fine, thank you," I said quickly. "We don't need any medical attention." "Oh, but I insist," Dr. Julio replied, and his tone became less friendly. "As the acting medical officer on this flight, I have a responsibility to ensure all passengers are in good health. It will just take a moment." He began unpacking his medical bag, and I could see syringes, small vials of clear liquid, and other medical instruments that looked more suited to a hospital than an airplane emergency kit. "Really, we're both feeling perfectly fine," Kazan said firmly. "We appreciate your concern, but we don't need any medical examination." Dr. Julio's smile disappeared entirely. "I'm afraid I wasn't asking. Airline regulations require that I examine any passengers who may have been psychologically affected by witnessing a medical emergency. It's for your own safety." That's when I realized we were in serious danger. This man wasn't a legitimate doctor responding to an emergency. He was something else entirely. And he was systematically incapacitating passengers for reasons I couldn't understand. "Kazan, we need to get away from him," I whispered urgently. But Dr. Julio had already prepared a syringe and was reaching for my arm. "This will just be a mild sedative to help you relax. Many passengers find flying stressful, and this will help you sleep peacefully for the rest of the journey." I jerked my arm away and stood up quickly. "Don't touch me. I don't consent to any medical treatment." Several other passengers looked over at the commotion, but I noticed that many of them had the same blank, unresponsive expressions as the people Dr. Julio had already treated. They were aware of what was happening but seemed unable or unwilling to react. "Ma'am, please sit down and cooperate," Dr. Julio said, but now his voice had a threatening edge. "I'm trying to help you, but I can use force if necessary." That's when Kazan stood up and positioned himself between Dr. Julio and me. She said no. "Back off." Dr. Julio reached into his medical bag and pulled out what looked like a small device, not a medical instrument, but something that resembled a taser or stun gun. "Both of you sit down immediately, or I'll have to use more aggressive methods to ensure your compliance," he said. I looked around the cabin for help, but the flight attendants were nowhere to be seen. The passengers who were still conscious seemed frightened but unwilling to get involved. And the people Dr. Julio had already treated were sitting like mannequins, completely oblivious to the confrontation happening around them. "What did you do to those people?" I demanded. "What's in those syringes?" Dr. Julio smiled coldly. "Nothing that will cause permanent damage. It's a specialized compound that temporarily suppresses higher brain functions while leaving basic motor and autonomic systems intact. They're perfectly safe. They just won't remember anything that happens during the flight, and they'll be very compliant with any instructions they receive. "You're drugging innocent people," Kazin said angrily. "Why? What's the point?" "Organ harvesting," Dr. Julio replied matter-of-factly. "Do you have any idea how valuable healthy organs are on the black market? A single kidney can sell for $200,000. A heart can bring in $500,000. Liver, corneas, bone marrow. It's all incredibly valuable if you know the right buyers." I felt sick to my stomach. "You're planning to kill these people and harvest their organs?" "Not kill exactly. The compound I'm using keeps them alive, but completely passive. They won't resist when we begin the extraction procedures. And when we're finished, we'll administer a different drug that will cause what appears to be natural cardiac arrest. By the time this plane lands in Reykjavik, we'll have a tragic story about multiple passengers dying from altitude-related medical complications. The flight crew must know about this," Kazin said. "They have to be part of it." "Of course they are." "Do you think I could operate freely on a commercial aircraft without cooperation from the airline?" "This entire flight is a cover operation. The passengers who boarded this plane in Denver are inventory. The people who land in Reykjavik will be a much smaller group." I realized that we were trapped on a flying operating room, with a killer who was systematically preparing passengers for organ harvesting. The people sitting motionlessly around us weren't just sedated. They were waiting to be butchered. "How many flights have you done this on?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I figured out some way to escape or fight back. "Dozens. International routes are perfect because there's time to complete the procedures during the flight. We have a fully equipped surgical suite in the cargo hold, and by the time we land, the harvesting is complete. The organs are shipped to buyers around the world, and the remaining components are disposed of in ways that support the cover story." Dr. Julio was preparing another syringe, this one larger than the others. "I really didn't want to use this on conscious subjects, but you're forcing my hand. This will be much more unpleasant than the standard sedative, but it will accomplish the same result." That's when I made a desperate decision. I grabbed the emergency oxygen mask above my seat and yanked it down as hard as I could. The action triggered an alarm, and yellow oxygen masks dropped throughout the cabin. In the confusion, Kazin tackled Dr. Julio, and they struggled for control of the syringe. I ran toward the front of the plane, looking for the flight attendants or anyone who could help us. But when I reached the galley area, I found the flight attendants calmly organizing medical equipment. Scalpels, surgical instruments, organ preservation containers. They looked up at me with the same cold, professional expressions I'd seen on Dr. Julio's face. "Ms. Patel, please return to your seat," one of them said. "Dr. Julio needs to complete your medical evaluation." I realized that the entire crew was part of this operation. There was no one on this plane who would help us. We were completely on our own. I ran back to find Kazin still fighting with Dr. Julio. Other passengers were starting to panic because of the oxygen mask deployment, but most of them were too drugged to react effectively. "Kazin," I shouted. "The whole crew is in on it. We have to find another way." That's when I remembered something from the safety demonstration, the emergency exits. If I could somehow trigger a decompression event, it might force the plane to make an emergency landing before Dr. Julio could complete his organ harvesting operation. I ran to the nearest emergency exit and began working on the door mechanism. It was designed to be difficult to open during flight, but I was motivated by pure terror and desperation. "Stop her!" Dr. Julio shouted, having apparently gained control of his struggle with Kazin. "She'll kill everyone on the plane." But I knew that everyone on the plane was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The only chance any of us had was to force this plane down before Dr. Julio could complete his gruesome work. The emergency door opened with a violent rush of air, and the cabin immediately began decompressing. Oxygen masks that had been deployed earlier became essential as the plane lost altitude rapidly. In the chaos that followed, I managed to grab K-Sen, and we positioned ourselves near emergency equipment, hoping to survive whatever happened next. Dr. Julio and his accomplices were struggling to maintain control of the situation, but the emergency landing procedures had been triggered automatically. The plane made an emergency landing at a military airfield in Greenland. When rescue personnel boarded the aircraft, they found dozens of passengers in various states of sedation, along with a cargo hold that had been converted into a mobile surgical suite. Dr. Julio and the flight crew were arrested, and their organ harvesting operation was exposed. Kazan and I testified about what we had witnessed, and the investigation revealed that this had been happening on multiple flights across different airlines. We never made it to Iceland for our honeymoon. Instead, we spent weeks dealing with international law enforcement agencies and medical teams who needed to examine the other passengers for signs of organ harvesting procedures. Some of the passengers recovered completely from the sedatives. Others had already undergone preliminary procedures and required extensive medical treatment. A few didn't survive. I still can't fly without thinking about what happened on that plane. Every time I see a passenger who looks like they might be a doctor, every time someone offers medical assistance during a flight, I remember Dr. Julio and his mobile organ harvesting operation. If you ever experience a medical emergency on a flight and the responding doctor seems too eager to treat other passengers, if people around you start acting strangely after receiving medical attention, if you notice unusual medical equipment that seems too sophisticated for an airplane emergency kit, trust your instincts and find a way to alert authorities on the ground. Because some medical emergencies are manufactured to provide cover for much more sinister operations. And some doctors flying at 35,000 feet aren't there to save lives. They're there to harvest them. The most dangerous predators are the ones who wear the uniforms of people we're supposed to trust. My name is Blake, and what I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. But I have proof that time itself can become distorted at 30,000 feet. My wife Harlow and I were flying from San Francisco to Honolulu on Hawaiian Airlines Flight 73. What should have been a routine 5-hour flight to start our honeymoon in paradise. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in a temporal loop that lasted 18 hours, while the crew insisted we had only been in the air for 3. The flight departed SFO at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Harlow was excited about our first trip to Hawaii together, taking photos through the window as we climbed over the Pacific Ocean. The weather was perfect, the plane was only half full, and everything seemed ideal for a romantic getaway. About an hour into the flight, I noticed something odd about my watch. The digital display showed 3:47 p.m., but when I looked at the in-flight entertainment system, it showed 3:23 p.m. I mentioned this to Harlow, but she just shrugged it off. Different time zones, maybe, she suggested, or the plane system hasn't updated properly. But as the flight continued, the time discrepancy got worse. My watch showed 4:30 p.m., but the plane system still displayed 3:23 p.m. I checked my phone, but it was in airplane mode and couldn't sync with any towers to verify the correct time. "Harlow, look at this," I said, showing her my watch. "Something's wrong with the time." She checked her own watch and frowned. "Mine shows 4:35 p.m., but look at that passenger's phone screen." I glanced over at the man across the aisle, who was looking at his phone. His screen clearly showed 3:23 p.m. exactly the same time as the plane's entertainment system. Over the next hour, I became obsessed with tracking time. I counted seconds in my head, monitored every clock I could see, and paid careful attention to natural indicators like the position of the sun outside our window. What I discovered was impossible. Time was passing at different rates throughout the aircraft. Some passengers' devices showed time moving normally, others showed it moving much slower, and a few seemed to be experiencing time moving faster than normal. "This doesn't make sense," I told Harlow. "Physics doesn't work this way." But the evidence was undeniable. I could watch the man in 12A looking at his phone, and his clock would advance 1 minute while mine advanced 3. Meanwhile, the woman in 8F seemed to be experiencing time at half speed. Her movements appeared sluggish, and her device's clock was barely moving at all, around what my watch indicated was 6 p.m., though the plane system still showed 3:23 p.m. I decided to walk around the cabin to investigate further. What I found was even more disturbing. Different sections of the plane seemed to exist in different temporal zones. In the front of the cabin, passengers were eating lunch and seemed to be experiencing normal time flow. In the middle section where Harlow and I were seated, people were at various stages of their meal service, with some finishing while others were just starting. But in the back of the plane, passengers appeared to be frozen in time. They were completely motionless, holding cups halfway to their lips, with expressions locked in place as if someone had pressed a pause button on their lives. "Excuse me," I said to a flight attendant. "What time is it?" She smiled and checked her watch. "It's 3:23 p.m., sir. We're making good time to Honolulu." "But that's the same time it was an hour ago," I said. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes went completely blank for a moment. "I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that?" I didn't understand your question. It was like she couldn't process what I was saying about time being wrong. Every time I tried to discuss the temporal anomalies with crew members, they would give me that same blank stare and respond as if they had to comprehend the concept of time moving abnormally. I returned to my seat and tried to explain what I had observed to Harlow. But something had changed about her too. She was moving more slowly than before, and when she spoke, her words seemed to take longer to form. "Blake, what are you talking about?" she said, each word stretched out unnaturally. I checked her watch, and it was now showing 3:23 p.m., exactly the same as the plane system. Somehow, she had been pulled into the slower time zone, while I remained in the faster-moving temporal field. As I continued to experience accelerated time, I watched in horror as Harlow became increasingly sluggish. Her movements became so slow that I could see individual frames of motion, like watching a video in extreme slow motion. By my watch, it was now 8 p.m. We should have been landing in Honolulu, but according to the plane's systems and most of the passengers, we were still only 3 hours into a 5-hour flight. I walked through the cabin again and discovered that the temporal distortions were getting worse. The passengers in the back of the plane weren't just moving slowly, they had stopped moving entirely. They were perfectly preserved in a single moment, like living statues. In the front section, some passengers seemed to be experiencing time so quickly that they appeared to be vibrating. Their movements were too fast for my eyes to follow clearly, and when they spoke, their voices sounded like high-pitched buzzing. I was trapped in the middle ground, moving at a rate that let me observe all the other temporal zones, but unable to communicate effectively with anyone in them. That's when I noticed the flight attendants were unaffected by the time distortions. They moved freely between all sections of the plane, interacting normally with passengers regardless of which temporal zone they occupied. What's happening to this plane? I demanded, cornering one of the flight attendants in the galley. She looked at me with that same blank expression, but this time she didn't give me a scripted response. Instead, she said something that chilled me to the bone. Time is relative, Mr. Blake, especially when you're traveling between dimensions. What do you mean, between dimensions? This flight doesn't just travel through space, sir. It travels through time as well. We're taking a shortcut through temporal space to reach our destination more efficiently. I stared at her in disbelief. That's impossible. Is it? You've been observing the effects for hours now. Different passengers are experiencing different temporal flows because we're passing through multiple time streams simultaneously. Most passengers don't notice because their consciousness gets locked into a single temporal rate. But occasionally, someone like you remains aware of the process. What about my wife? What's happening to her? She's experiencing time at the standard rate for this flight. 1 hour of subjective time for every 3 hours of objective time. You, unfortunately, are experiencing objective time, which is why the flight feels much longer to you. By my count, we had been in the air for nearly 10 hours, but according to the plane's systems, it was still 3:23 p.m., and we were still 3 hours away from landing. How is this possible? I asked. Advanced temporal engineering, the flight attendant replied matter-of-factly. The airline industry discovered years ago that they could reduce fuel costs and increase efficiency by taking shortcuts through time itself. Instead of flying through normal space-time, we navigate through temporal currents that allow us to cover the same distance in less objective time. But I'm experiencing more time, not less. That's an unfortunate side effect. About 1 in every 1,000 passengers experiences temporal displacement during these flights. You're conscious of both subjective and objective time simultaneously, which means you experience the full duration of our journey through temporal space. I looked around the cabin with new understanding. The passengers weren't just experiencing different rates of time. They were being transported through actual time streams, like a river, with different currents at different depths. What happens when we land? I asked. Everyone's temporal experience will synchronize. Your wife will have experienced a normal 5-hour flight. You will have experienced. She checked some kind of device. Approximately 18 hours of subjective time. But officially, the flight will have taken 5 hours, and you'll both arrive at the scheduled time. 18 hours. I felt exhausted just thinking about it. I'm afraid so. And there's nothing we can do to adjust your temporal rate once the process has begun. You'll have to experience the full duration of our journey through the time stream. Over the next several hours, by my perception, I watched the temporal zones in the cabin shift and change. Some passengers moved from slow time to normal time. Others shifted into accelerated time zones. The frozen passengers in the back occasionally flickered back to life for a few moments before freezing again. Harlow remained locked in slow time, moving at about 1/3 normal speed from my perspective. I could interact with her, but our conversations took forever as she struggled to form words at her temporal rate while I responded at mine. Blake, something feels wrong, she managed to say over the course of what felt like 20 minutes. I know, I replied. Just try to stay calm. We'll be landing soon. But soon was a relative term when you're experiencing time at different rates. I spent the remaining hours documenting everything I observed, taking notes on my phone about the temporal distortions, the passenger behaviors, and the crew's explanations. I was determined to have proof of what had happened, even if no one would believe me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I felt a strange sensation, like everything was snapping back into place. The temporal zones throughout the cabin suddenly synchronized, and all the passengers seemed to be moving at the same rate again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Honolulu, the captain announced. Local time is 7:15 p.m., and we should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. I checked my watch, which now showed 7:15 p.m., matching all the other clocks on the plane. Harlow looked at me with clear, normally paced speech. "That was a nice flight," she said. "I slept through most of it." "Did anything interesting happen?" I looked at my phone where I had been documenting the temporal anomalies. All of my notes were gone. The file showed only normal flight observations, comments about the meal service, the movie selection, the view out the window. But I still remembered everything. The 18 hours of subjective time, the temporal zones, the frozen passengers, the crew's explanation about dimensional travel. When we landed, the flight logs showed a normal 5-hour flight from San Francisco to Honolulu. Every passenger I asked said they had experienced a routine, uneventful journey. Even Harlow had no memory of the temporal distortions or our slow-motion conversations. I'm the only one who remembers what really happened on that flight. 18 hours of my life that officially never occurred, experienced in a temporal bubble while traveling through time streams that the airline industry uses to increase efficiency. I've researched temporal engineering and dimensional travel since then. But there's no public information about airlines using these technologies. Officially, such things don't exist. But I know what I experienced. And now, whenever I fly, I pay very close attention to the clocks. If you ever notice that time seems wrong during a flight, if your watch doesn't match the plane's systems, if other passengers seem to be moving at different speeds, don't dismiss it as jet lag or altitude effects. You might be experiencing temporal displacement, traveling through time streams that most people's consciousness can't perceive. And if that happens, just remember that 18 hours can pass, while officially only 5 hours have elapsed. And you might be the only person who remembers the journey between dimensions. Some flights don't just take you to different places. They take you through different streams of time itself. My name is Luna, and I'm writing this from a police station in Rome because I discovered that my husband had been planning to sacrifice me long before we ever exchanged vows. Our honeymoon flight from New York to Italy was supposed to be the beginning of our new life together. But instead, it became the culmination of a ritual that Dante had been orchestrating for months. I should have noticed the signs earlier. During our engagement, Dante had become obsessed with ancient mythology, particularly stories about gods who demanded human sacrifices in exchange for power and wealth. He spent hours researching obscure religious practices and reading books about pre-Christian Italian cults that worshipped entities from what he called the Old Darkness. But he was charming about it, framing his interest as research for his art history dissertation. I'm studying how ancient belief systems influenced Renaissance artwork, he would explain when I found another stack of books about blood rituals and demonic pacts in our apartment. The flight from JFK to Rome was on Alitalia, departing at 10 p.m. for an overnight journey across the Atlantic. Dante had insisted on booking seats in a specific section of the plane, row 13, seats A and B. When I pointed out that many people considered 13 an unlucky number, he just smiled and said it was perfect for our new beginning. "Everything has to be exactly right, Luna," he said as we boarded. "This trip will change our lives forever." About 2 hours into the flight, when most passengers were settling in for the long journey, Dante began acting strangely. He kept checking his watch and looking around the cabin with an expression I had never seen before. predatory, and calculating. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked. "You seem nervous." "Not nervous," he replied, his voice taking on an odd, formal tone. "Anticipatory. We're approaching the most important moment of our relationship." He reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a small leather journal that I had never seen before. The cover was worn and stained, with symbols carved into the leather that looked ancient and somehow threatening. "What is that?" I asked. "A family heirloom," Dante said, opening to a page covered in handwritten text that appeared to be in Latin. "My great-grandfather's journal. He was involved in traditional practices that helped our family achieve prosperity for generations." As he read from the journal, I noticed that his voice was changing. The words came out in a rhythmic chant, and although they were in Latin, I somehow understood their meaning. He was calling to something, requesting its attention, offering it a gift in exchange for wealth and power. "Dante, what are you doing?" I whispered urgently. "You're scaring me." "Don't be scared, Luna. Be honored. You've been chosen for something magnificent." That's when I realized, with growing horror, that he was talking about me. I was the gift he was offering, the sacrifice he had been planning all along. I looked around the cabin desperately, but the other passengers seemed oblivious to what was happening. Some were sleeping, others were watching movies or reading. The flight attendants were busy with service preparations, and no one seemed to notice that my husband was performing some kind of ritual sacrifice at 35,000 feet. "Dante, stop this," I said, trying to grab the journal from his hands. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop it right now." But he held the book away from me and continued chanting. As he spoke, I began to notice changes in the atmosphere around us. The air felt heavier, colder, and there was a strange pressure in my ears that had nothing to do with altitude. "Our marriage was never about love, Luna," Dante said without looking up from his journal. "It was about positioning. The entity I serve requires specific types of sacrifices. Young women with pure hearts, offered willingly by someone they trust completely. A bride offered by her new husband is the most powerful sacrifice possible." I felt sick to my stomach. "You don't love me at all?" "I love what you represent. Your innocence, your trust, your complete faith in our relationship. Those qualities make you incredibly valuable to the entity that has been guiding my family's success for 4 generations. As he continued reading from the journal, I noticed that other passengers were starting to act strangely. A man 2 rows ahead began scratching at his arms compulsively. A woman across the aisle started whimpering softly, as if she were having a nightmare while awake. "What's happening to them?" I asked. "The entity's presence affects sensitive individuals," Dante explained matter-of-factly. "It feeds on fear and suffering, so being in proximity to it causes psychological distress in some people. Don't worry. The effects are temporary for them. For you, however." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Whatever was happening to me was going to be permanent. I looked toward the cargo hold and realized with growing terror that something was down there. Something that Dante had arranged to be transported on this specific flight. Something that was waiting for the ritual to be completed so it could claim its sacrifice. "What's in the cargo hold, Dante?" "A very old friend of my family. It's been waiting patiently for this moment, for the perfect offering. Your death will provide it with enough energy to grant me everything I've ever wanted: wealth, power, influence. I'll be able to live like a king for the rest of my life." "And you're willing to murder your wife for that?" "You were never my wife, Luna. You were always my sacrifice. The wedding ceremony was just part of the ritual preparation. Everything had to be done in the correct order. The courtship, the proposal, the wedding, the honeymoon flight. Each step made you more valuable as an offering. I realized that our entire relationship had been a lie. Every moment of tenderness, every expression of love, every shared dream about our future together. It had all been an elaborate performance designed to make me trust him completely so that I would be the perfect sacrifice. As Dante continued his chanting, the disturbances among the other passengers got worse. The man who had been scratching his arms was now bleeding, clawing at his skin as if something were crawling underneath it. The woman across the aisle was sobbing uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror. I could feel something responding to Dante's call, something ancient and hungry rising from the cargo hold below us. The temperature in the cabin was dropping, and I could see my breath in the increasingly cold air. "The entity is awakening," Dante said with satisfaction. "Soon it will come for you, and our pact will be complete." That's when I made a desperate decision. I couldn't overpower Dante physically, and I couldn't count on help from the other passengers or crew members. But I could try to disrupt the ritual itself. I grabbed Dante's journal and tore out several pages before he could stop me. "No," he screamed. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," I said, continuing to destroy the journal. "You're a monster who never loved me, and I'm not going to let you feed me to whatever nightmare you've brought onto this plane." As I destroyed more pages of the ritual text, the disturbances in the cabin began to subside. The bleeding man stopped scratching himself, and the crying woman seemed to calm down. Whatever entity Dante had been summoning was losing its connection to our world. But Dante wasn't giving up. He lunged at me, trying to retrieve the remaining pages of his journal, and we struggled in our seats while other passengers started to notice the commotion. "She's having a breakdown," Dante shouted to anyone who would listen. "My wife is having some kind of mental crisis. She needs medical attention." But I could see in his eyes that he was the one who was panicking. Without the complete ritual, his plan was falling apart, and the entity he had been trying to summon was growing angry at being denied its promised sacrifice. That's when I felt something that made my blood freeze. Whatever was in the cargo hold was trying to come upstairs anyway, ritual or no ritual. I could hear sounds from below, not mechanical noises from the plane systems, but something organic and hungry moving around down there. "It's coming anyway," Dante said with a mixture of fear and excitement. "The entity is strong enough to claim you without the full ritual. It just won't be as pleasant for either of us." The sounds from below were getting louder, and I could hear what sounded like claws scraping against metal. Other passengers were starting to notice the noise and looking around with confused expressions. "What is that sound?" a man behind us asked. "Cargo shifting," a flight attendant replied, but her voice lacked conviction. I knew I had to do something drastic. I stood up and shouted as loudly as I could. "There's something in the cargo hold. My husband brought something dangerous onto this plane, and it's trying to get into the cabin." Most passengers looked at me like I was having a mental breakdown, just as Dante had intended. But a few seemed to hear the sounds I was talking about, and their expressions changed from confusion to concern. "Ma'am, please sit down," a flight attendant said, approaching our row. "You're disturbing other passengers." "Check the cargo manifest," I demanded. "See what my husband arranged to have transported on this flight." The flight attendant looked at Dante, who was trying to appear concerned and embarrassed by his unstable wife's behavior. "She's been under a lot of stress lately," he said. "The wedding, the travel, It's all been overwhelming for her. But the sounds from below were getting impossible to ignore. Other passengers were looking toward the floor with worried expressions, and I could see some of them starting to panic. That's when the lights in the cabin began to flicker, and the temperature dropped even further. Whatever Dante had brought onto the plane was making its presence known, ritual or no ritual. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing in Gander, Newfoundland. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." But I knew this wasn't a technical problem. This was something much worse. As the plane began its descent, I could hear the entity in the cargo hold becoming more agitated. The scratching sounds turned into what sounded like pounding, as if something were trying to break through the floor of the cabin. "It's not going to wait," Dante said, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine fear. "Without the proper ritual controls, the entity might kill everyone on this plane, not just you." "Then stop it," I demanded. "If you brought this thing here, you must know how to control it." "I can't stop it now," he admitted. "The summoning process has gone too far. The only way to satisfy it is to give it what it wants. Which is me. Which is you." I realized that I was trapped. If I allowed Dante to complete his sacrifice, I would die, but the other passengers might survive. If I continued to resist, the entity might kill everyone on the plane in its frustration. As we descended toward the emergency landing, I made my choice. Instead of giving in to Dante's demands, I decided to fight the entity directly. I took the remaining pages of Dante's journal and began reading the Latin text myself. But instead of summoning the entity, I tried to banish it. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. The effect was immediate. The pounding from below stopped, and the temperature in the cabin began to return to normal. Whatever I was doing was working. "You don't know what you're doing," Dante screamed. "You'll kill us all." But the plane landed safely in Gander, and when the authorities boarded the aircraft, they found evidence of Dante's plan in the cargo hold. Ritual implements, ancient symbols carved into containers, and documentation of his family's history of human sacrifice. Dante was arrested and eventually convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, and several other charges related to his attempt to perform a human sacrifice. The investigation revealed that his family had been involved in occult practices for generations, using ritual murder to gain wealth and power. I'm safe now, but I'll never forget how close I came to being sacrificed by the man I thought loved me. Our entire relationship was a lie, carefully constructed to make me the perfect offering to an ancient evil. If your partner ever becomes obsessed with occult practices, if they insist on specific travel arrangements that seem unusual, if they start talking about your relationship in terms of destiny or sacrifice, trust your instincts and get away from them. Because some people view marriage not as a partnership, but as a hunting strategy. And some honeymoons are designed to be one-way trips to places darker than death itself. That concludes our terrifying journey through 10 disturbing honeymoon airplane horror stories. Each tale reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from the people we trust most, and that the skies above us hide horrors we never imagined possible. If these stories have kept you awake at night or made you question your next flight, then I've done my job. Remember to subscribe to Mr. Nightveil for more spine-chilling true horror stories that will make you see the world differently. Hit that notification bell, because you never know when the next nightmare will take flight. Until next time, keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and remember, not every flight is designed to reach its intended destination. Sweet dreams, and safe travels.